Topic Notes 5.1 Nutrient Cycles. This is a picture of some mangroves out at Everglades National Park. Now, most people don't think of mangroves being in Everglades because Everglades is a freshwater system, but these are actually towards the Florida Bay section, and that's where saltwater and freshwater mix, which is a perfect place for mangroves. And I wanted to show you a picture of a plant because we're going to be talking about nutrients. And if you've ever taken care of a plant before, you know that they need sunlight, they need water, and you often also have to add some sort of fertilizer, which is nitrogen and phosphorus, into the soil to get them to grow. And that is part of the nutrient cycle. And this happens naturally, and we're going to talk a lot about nutrients in this set of notes. So here's our main idea. Nutrient cycles involve the essential movement and recycling of elements necessary for organisms to live and grow. Marine productivity is also tied to nutrient availability. And of course, here are your learning goals. Make sure you are paying attention to these and referring to your learning scales. So let's jump into it. A system is a set of components that function and interact in some regular or theoretically understandable manner. Now, scientists use systems and models, for that matter, to try and understand these processes and hopefully predict outcomes that will help us make good decisions in terms of managing resources or understanding how processes work. An example of a system, and a model of a system, would be photosynthesis, and that's kind of what's shown on the right there. You actually see sunlight coming in and energy being transferred and all that sort of thing. You kind of know how photosynthesis works. So that can be looked at as a system because it has inputs, it has processes within it, and it has an output. So let's look at these different components. So systems generally have some sort of transfers or flows going into them, within them, and coming out of them. Now, an example of this would be ocean currents, for example. It transfers not only matter, but also heat, thermal energy. If you look at this diagram in the bottom here, you'll notice all these red arrows are generally warm water currents, and they're bringing warm water up, usually from equatorial regions, into cooler regions. That's what the Gulf Stream does. There are other currents that bring cool water from the higher latitudes down into the equatorial regions. This is actually a big reason as to why the Earth has kind of more of a stable temperature regime. So this is an example of transfers of energy and matter. Now we'll move on to transformations. Transformations is where you're taking either energy or matter from one state and changing it to another. An example with this would be to take chemical energy, for example, the energy stored in glucose molecules between bonds, go through cellular respiration, break that bond, and release that energy and use it to ride a bike, that top little part of the image. Also, the similar thing, radiant energy from the sun being captured by a plant through the process of photosynthesis and turning it into stored chemical energy. So those are transformations that occur. Now, we also have storages and reservoirs where we will keep large quantities of a particular type of nutrients or energy or whatever. So that's what we have. We have transfers, transformations, and storages that all function within a system. And we're going to see how that plays out with other biogeochemical cycles and nutrient cycles. Okay, so there's three types of systems that we can talk about: closed, open, and isolated systems. I'm going to start with the center picture and open systems. Open systems basically means matter and energy exchange in and out of the system all the time. Most ecosystems are like this. The center diagram is basically showing flow within a forest system, and you have matter and energy coming in and out of it all the time. Now, the other two, closed and isolated systems, the definition often changes a little bit depending on what course you're taking. Because a lot of our students in the academy end up taking IB Environmental Systems, I'm going to go with that definition that IB uses for future reference. In that definition, a closed system is self-contained. There's no exchange of matter, but energy can be exchanged. A big example of this would be planet Earth. Okay, energy from the sun is constantly going in, and energy also radiates back out. But matter, for all intents and purposes, is isolated within the Earth system. Now, I know you can get technical and say, oh, well, what happens when an asteroid comes and slams into the planet? That's adding matter. Well, yeah, it is. So, again, these aren't perfect definitions, but the gist of it is for the most part, the matter that we have is the matter we have. There's not a whole exodus or matter coming in and out of the system too much in terms of Earth. Now, an isolated system really doesn't have a whole lot of examples. This is where there's no exchange of matter or energy. The only real isolated system that we can name in terms of nature or the universe is literally the universe. The universe is based on how far it's expanded since the Big Bang, basically. And there's a limit to the distance light and matter have been able to travel. So beyond that limit, there's no exchange of anything. In fact, we really don't know what's beyond. So it is what it is. So that's kind of the example of an isolated system, and really that's the only example you can use if asked on a test about it. Okay, now on to nutrients. What is a nutrient? So generally speaking, we say it's a substance that provides nourishment essential for growth and maintenance of life. Now, being a human being growing up in our society, you've probably heard, you need plenty of water, you need proteins and vitamins and minerals and fiber and all carbohydrates, fats, everything. All of those are considered nutrients in a manner of speaking, and you need them to be able to grow properly. Well, the same thing goes for pretty much every other life form on the planet. They need a certain amount of nutrients, whether it's a plant or an animal. Now, we can split nutrients up into organic versus inorganic. Organic would be carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Inorganic would be salts, which also include things like magnesium and calcium. So when we talk about nutrient cycles themselves, we're talking the movement of these nutrients through the ecosystem, usually dealing with exchanges between organic to inorganic forms. And this is through both fixation processes and, of course, decomposition and release back into inorganic molecules. The water cycle is actually pretty important here simply because it tends to be the vehicle in which a lot of these nutrients flow through the system. Another term to look out for is biogeochemical cycles. A lot of times nutrient cycles coincide with biogeochemical cycles, and you will sometimes see them both in the same context within various literature. And of course, within a system, nutrients and matter are finite. So you generally are dealing with limitations when you talk about population growth and carrying capacity based on the available nutrients that are there. And both geological and biological processes affect the amount of nutrients that are in any particular location. Now, within nutrient cycles, you're always going to see some form of assimilation, and that's the conversion of nutrients into a usable form that can be incorporated into the tissues of an organism. So this is the transition from an abiotic to a biotic form. An example of this would be carbon dioxide, CO2, which is fixed during photosynthesis into glucose. And from there, it is converted to other molecules by the producer itself, by the plant, like starch. And from there, of course, it can be cycled up through the trophic levels through consumption by herbivores and whatnot. On the image on the right, you can see the plant where it's taking in both water, oxygen, O2, CO2, and of course nutrients through the roots. On the flip side, nutrients can be lost from the system through excretion, of course, everything's got to go to the bathroom, and released through decomposition. After an animal passes on, it's going to be decomposed through bacteria or sometimes even consumed directly, and thus those nutrients are either released or transferred. Now, the ocean itself is an important reservoir for various types of nutrients, which basically means they can be held for long periods of time. And we get to this term called residence time, which is the average time that a particle spins in a particular system. So, as you might expect, residency times can be different depending on the system and situation you're in. In the ocean, nutrients that fall to the bottom can often have very long residency times. So, for example, fecal matter or dead organisms that fall into the deep sea can often become part of bottom sediments, sometimes for hundreds or sometimes even thousands of years. Whereas residency times in the surface waters can be much shorter, simply because, for example, a coral reef that you have pictured on the right, you have lots of biological activity going on, so nothing really stays in one place very long at all. But of course, in the deep sea, we do have ways of recovering those resources. The picture on the left, you see actually those kind of blobby things are actually sea cucumbers, which tend to be one of the most populous organisms in the deep sea. And they're constantly taking up and hoovering up the dead organic matter that falls to the bottom. Now, this brings us up to the point where we mentioned the fact that most of the nutrients end up getting sequestered and trapped into the deep sea. So now we'll look at methods of which we can actually replenish, especially surface waters. And one method is, of course, upwelling, which is the movement of cold water from the deep in the ocean towards the surface. And this happens in several different ways. We'll get into a little bit more when we talk about ocean currents. However, that deep water is full of nutrients. An example of this is actually off the coast of South America. And if you look at the graph below, you'll see that that's showing chlorophyll. Of course, we talked about how that can be a really good indicator of productivity. And those oranges and yellows are showing high productivity areas with high chlorophyll counts right off the coast of South America. This is actually one of the most productive fisheries in the world and is due to upwelling along the coastline there. Another source is simply from runoff from land, and this can happen naturally. We see it whenever we have natural rivers that exit into the ocean, like Mississippi or the Amazon. But it can also happen through man-made factors. This image is, of course, of an inlet. You can see the spread of water, the darker water coming out of the inlet into the ocean. A lot of times, inlets, especially around developed areas, can hold a lot of nutrients, especially from urban runoff, agricultural practices, things like that. We can also look at dissolved atmospheric gases like carbon dioxide and even nitrogen. Now, the amount of gas that can be dissolved into water depends on a few factors. First, temperature. The lower the temperature, the more dissolved gas can actually be held in the water. This is why a lot of times you'll see fishermen put ice in some of their bait buckets or cool them down to help hold more oxygen into the water. Atmospheric concentrations of gas also play a role as well. The higher the concentration in the atmosphere, the more diffusion you're going to get into the ocean. And of course, mixing of the surface layers is a big factor as well. Anytime you have waves or disturbance on the surface, that's going to create a disturbance of the surface layer of water. Remember, we talked about how hydrogen bonding keeps that water tension going. And so anytime you have disturbance of that, you can have more dissolved gases coming into the water as well. This is one of the reasons why we put aerators in tanks. It's not so much that the bubbles themselves are putting oxygen into the water, but it disturbs the surface, allowing more gases to diffuse in. Now, generally in the ocean, when we talk about dissolved gases, overall concentrations tend to remain at an equilibrium, but they can vary. Anywhere we have what we call sinks are areas where more gases are dissolved into the water than diffusing into the atmosphere. Sources are areas where you would have more gases diffusing into the atmosphere than dissolving into the water. So it depends on which way you're going in terms of calling it a sink or a source of a particular gas. This is one of the reasons why we tend to call the ocean a carbon sink, because right now we have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and thus it is diffusing into the ocean. This, of course, brings up some issues in terms of ocean acidification. And of course, the last replenishment we'll talk about has to do with nutrient recycling. And that's recycling through biological processes. So you have excretions, you have decomposition, and all of that ends up releasing things like nitrogen and phosphorus, even carbon, back into the environment. This picture is actually of a whale fall. So this particular whale is probably sitting on the bottom for a couple of years maybe, and it's decomposing and creating kind of an entire platform for a whole ecosystem to occur around that carcass. And of course, what we can add, we can also deplete and take away. And so when we talk about removal of dissolved nutrients, one of the primary things that come to mind would be the uptake by primary producers like phytoplankton. Just like plants, they need nutrients to survive and grow. So they use these nutrients along with sunlight and water for the synthesis of organic substances. And of course, then those are transferred across subsequent trophic levels from phytoplankton to zooplankton to fish and whatnot. Now, staying with the concept of phytoplankton and zooplankton in general, when phytoplankton and zooplankton die, they are going to then fall out of those surface waters towards the deeper ocean. And they become what we call marine snow, which is a general term we use for this sort of phenomenon. And if you look at deep sea sediments, they're very white and very calcareous, actually. They got a lot of calcium in there. And that's simply because it's made up of all the different little components from all these phytoplankton and zooplankton that pass on and end up in those deep oceans. So that is a removal of a lot of that nutrients into the deep sea where it's sequestered for quite a while. Now, this can be consumed by multiple different trophic levels on the seafloor. I showed you a picture of the sea cucumbers consuming those deep sea sediments, and that is part of that. But it's a slow process of decomposition due to the lack of oxygen and the low temperature in deep sea environments. Now, more in surface waters, there's other ways that we can remove dissolved nutrients. For example, coral reefs, they're constantly taking in different types of minerals, everything from calcium, magnesium, things like that, and they're building their coral skeletons. And that does trap those nutrients in those skeletal systems for a long period of time before they are broken up and released later on. Another method is removing through harvesting from human consumption. So we're out there taking lots of fish out of the water. That's taking all that nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon that are in those bodies, and we are putting it into land resources like us. So that's removing it from the ocean system. Now we'll turn our attention to some of the specific cycles that I want you to know about. However, you're going to spend a little bit more time on this in the classroom. We're just going to briefly go over it here. So the carbon cycle obviously is hugely important to living things because we're a carbon-based organism, as you might have heard. And the reason why, of course, is carbon. It has an atomic number of 6. It's got 4 valence electrons, which basically means it can make 4 different bonds with other things, which makes it really a good connector atom, basically, in various molecules, especially specific organic molecules. So, everything, proteins, carbohydrates, you name it, it's all there. Carbon is the base of those molecules. That's why we are carbon-based organisms. Now, in terms of the carbon cycle in the ocean, it's very similar to on land and everything else. Carbon is held up in biological tissues, living biomass. So as organisms die, whether it's phytoplankton, zooplankton, fish, whales, whatever, decomposition happens and that carbon is re-released to continue through the cycle. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration are obviously big components to the carbon cycle as well, because we're breathing out through respiration CO2, and photosynthesis is taking it in and recombining it up with organic molecules. So there's that. There's also weathering and physical erosion that will actually add carbon into the system as well, trapped in rocks. So that does happen. And of course, burning of fossil fuels. we have to touch on that briefly too, because that's a big issue as well. Okay, nitrogen is sort of a biggie. And it's a biggie because it's probably one of the hardest ones for everybody to sort of understand. First of all, nitrogen is essential for proteins, nucleic acids, so for living things, it's really a must. And it goes through a series of steps because we can't just use nitrogen as it normally is, especially in the atmosphere. Speaking of the atmosphere, that's where we're going to begin. So if you dig back into the earth science knowledge in your head, you might remember that nitrogen accounts for about 78% of the volume of the atmosphere in terms of what we breathe. Kind of crazy, considering most people think, oh, we're breathing oxygen. Not so much, but, 21% so much. But anyway, back to nitrogen. So we can't use nitrogen as is, as N2 floating around the atmosphere. Now, a certain amount of nitrogen will actually obviously diffuse into the ocean. Either way, we rely on bacteria. Yes, folks, bacteria. Bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria that will convert the N2 into something that we can actually start to work with at least, which is ammonia, NH3. From there, we have another process called nitrification. And nitrification relies on nitrifying bacteria to convert that ammonium into nitrites and eventually nitrates. This is a key process because nitrates and nitrites can be absorbed and assimilated by plants in the ocean, specifically phytoplankton, but otherwise stuff like any plant, trees, grasses, whatever, and they can assimilate it into their tissues, and then it's now part of the food chain because if organisms eat them, whether it's zooplankton eating phytoplankton or gazelle grazing on grass or us eating a salad, we are getting that nitrogen from that. That's assimilation. So then we have the inevitability of life. Things die. Specifically, phytoplankton dies, zooplankton dies, fish die, whales die, sea lions die, things die. As they die, they're going to go through the process of decomposition, which is another bacterial process for the most part, fungi and stuff. And through that process, there's something called ammonification, which basically releases ammonias back out into the water. The other part about this is living things, while they're alive, they'll actually, of course, go through biological processes that produce waste, otherwise meaning they poop and pee, they defecate. And that also releases ammonias into the water. So between those two things, ammonification happens, and we then need to rely back to that nitrifying bacteria. And that nitrifying bacteria is going to, again, bring us back to nitrates and nitrites. And from there, we can assimilate again. That becomes a cycle, a kind of a cycle within a cycle, going from, nitrification to assimilation, ammonification, and back to nitrification again. Now, there is a way out of this loop, and it's another set of bacteria. Bacteria are really big here in the nitrogen cycle, and that's denitrification. And that's where it basically takes the nitrates and nitrites and converts them back into N2, which can then go back out to the atmosphere again. So, back to the basics. If you've ever wondered why the ocean doesn't get completely nasty with all the fish and whales and dolphins peeing and pooping in the water all the time, you can thank bacteria, because bacteria are cleaning it all up all the time, putting it back into usable form, and putting it back into the system for us to be able to get those important components, specifically nitrogen in this particular case, into our bodies for the proteins and amino acids and all those molecules that we need to develop to grow. All right, phosphorus up next. So phosphorus, another element important to life. It is part of ADP and ATP, so our energy molecules, which are really important. Phosphate's also a part of DNA, nucleic acids, and components of bones and teeth, so quite a lot of application there. The key thing to remember with phosphate cycle, and again, I'm going to go kind of light on the phosphate cycle and let you really do it on your own, but the phosphate cycle does not have an atmospheric component, so it first and foremost is only really transported around by water for the most part. It dissolves from rocks, gets into the water, and then of course it's passed along by living things, very much like carbon and nitrogen are in terms of how organisms will eventually die and decompose and release things back as well. So there are those parts of the cycle. And of course, remember, phosphates are a limiting factor in the ocean, so they're really a big player in whether or not you have high productivity in the area, whether your phytoplankton is doing its thing. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so we're just going to touch briefly on some of these inorganic nutrients because the story is going to start to refrain a little bit. First of all, calcium, again, hugely important. It makes up pretty much everything that's bone or exoskeleton or shell related, even coral skeletons. It is a big component of that, specifically calcium carbonate. So calcium is tied to the carbon cycle quite a bit as well. And again, it comes through weathering of rocks and dissolved from various types of basalt in the ocean floor as well. So it gets into the system that way, and it's cycled through marine organisms. Very, very important component, but obviously not as prominent as sodium chloride, for example. So calcium is often considered a limiting factor as well within marine life and their development. Now, magnesium, again, is kind of a trace mineral, if you will, and it is, again, a key component to biological beings, especially in the form of skeletal growth, but also it's a key component of chlorophyll, which obviously makes a big difference for, phytoplankton and productivity in general. Okay, it's now time to throw it back to you. I'm hoping that you're really starting to see the connectivity of everything that we're talking about here, and we're going to bring in some of our aquariums now for this in-depth question. How does the nitrogen cycle control the quality of the water within an aquarium? And what could cause an imbalance, basically a buildup of toxic chemicals, such as ammonium, that could potentially cause fish to die? So think about that, write about it, and explain it. And until next time, keep thinking.